This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rights, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rights is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rights on their website at sacred-rights.org or find Sacred Rights on Twitter at sacred_rights. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. Since 2017, I have talked to professors, authors, teachers, journalists, practitioners, and scholars about all things related to religion. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome back to the podcast Dr. Samira Mehta. Samira Mehta is an associate professor of women and gender studies and Jewish studies at CU Boulder. Her research focuses on the intersections of religion, culture, and gender, including the politics of family life and reproduction in the U.S. Her first book, Beyond Chrismukkah, The Christian-Jewish Interfaith Family in the United States, was a National Jewish Book Award finalist and was featured on this podcast. The topic of this episode is about her book of personal essays, The Racism of People Who Love You, from Beacon Press in 2023. Which was called The Epitome of a Book Meeting a Moment by Oprah's Books We Can't Wait to Read in 2023. Mehta's current academic book project, God Bless the Pill, Sexuality and Contraception in Tri-Faith America, examines the role of Jewish, Catholic, and Protestant voices in moral logics of contraception, population control, and eugenics in the mid-20th century, and is previewed in this episode. Please enjoy my conversation with Dr. Samira Mehta. Dr. Samira Mehta, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm delighted that you're back. I'm wondering if you can spend a moment and introduce yourself just a little bit to the audience out there so they know who you are and what you do.
Sure. My name is Samira Mehta. I am an associate professor of women's studies and Jewish studies at the University of Colorado Boulder, which means that I have gotten promoted since I was last year, which is exciting, and is, largely the book that I was here talking about last time, Beyond Chrismukkah, Christian-Jewish Interfaith Families in the United States, was the book that I wrote for the tenure process. I'm actually coming to you from Harvard Divinity School, where I'm finishing up a year of leave as a research associate in the Women's Studies and Religion program.
Well, you were here last on Classical Ideas in mid-December of 2019 for episode 142. So as I'm working on about episode number 300 or so, you were smack dab in the middle of all the episodes that I've done here, which is really crazy for me to think about the lifespan of the show, and having people come back 5 years apart is a little jarring for me as well. But I am curious about, the aftermath of the release of your other book, Beyond Chrismukkah. What that process was like for you to see the book go out into the world. And I'm just curious about any major takeaways or feedback that you got that you enjoyed from readers out there that you came across over the years.
One of the things that I've found most exciting is the opportunity to talk to people who didn't feel that their experience of interfaith family life was reflected in the literature that existed, right? When I wrote my first book, most of the literature about interfaith family life really came from Jewish perspectives. And in some ways, that's true of my book as well. I'm a cultural historian and cultural ethnographer, and most of the cultural production about interfaith families comes out of Jewish settings and addresses, therefore, Jewish needs. And, things happen like, for instance, a lot of interfaith family activists really object to the idea that you would talk about the Jewish person and the not Jewish person, right? Because the not Jewish person obviously has a history and a tradition and an identity that are defined by things other than the absence of Judaism. But if you're a Jewish communal organization, the relevant thing is that one person is Jewish and one person is not. And as much as I say somewhere in like something I talked about after the fact, as much as I would like to be able to be like the Methodist, Episcopalian, Quaker, Presbyterian, Hindu, Muslim, and already, right, like there are, as many, I just listed a ton of kinds of Protestants, and then Hinduism. There are lots of ways of being Hindu. There are lots of ways of being Muslim. There are lots of ways of being Buddhist. Catholic Lakota, half of the partnership, right? Like any possible permutation, realistically, unless I was talking about a really specific couple, right? I talk about a Jewish Mormon couple. I talk about a Unitarian couple where she came from Reform Judaism and he came from the Missouri Synod of Lutheranism. Like, unless you've got an explicit example like that, from like the standpoint of all of this cultural production, which is Jewish, there's the Jewish person and the not Jewish person, and it means different things, right? So I had all of these conversations with folks about what that meant, what it meant to where I successfully gave voice to interfaith families who are making choices that institutional Judaism might wish they didn't make. And where, because of the nature of the cultural production, my language fell into patterns that some of these people don't like. So that was really interesting, right? And I've thought a lot more about being really careful to be specific when I can be, and to give disclaimers when I can't be, right? Like, it isn't actually feasible to brainstorm every permutation. And even if I could make a list like that, you run into the problems that in the United States, we do granular discussions for Protestantism and not for any number of other traditions that are equally granular in their fulsome lived reality, but not in the American imagination. So it was really interesting to hear things like that. And so I got a lot of feedback there. I've gotten the opportunity to work with programs that train rabbis to work with interfaith families.
Cool.
And have gotten a chance to represent some of the viewpoints of people that I studied to those rabbis. And part of what's fun about me coming in and getting to do that is the people that I read about, or wrote about rather, I also read about them, but the people that I wrote about don't represent one viewpoint, right? I interviewed people who chose to be Jewish in their family manifestation after an interfaith marriage. And I wrote about families that chose to do both, and both what it meant to be Jewish and do Jewish, and what it meant to do both was really varied. There were a lot of people who chose to affiliate with Jewish communities, who thought of themselves as Jewish families, who actually, in terms of what was going on in their homes, didn't look all that different from families that chose to be explicitly both. Sometimes the difference there was that the people who were choosing to be explicitly both affiliated with more than one community, or affiliated with a third community, right? Affiliated as Unitarian or in an explicitly interfaith community, or didn't affiliate at all, which in the end also looked like a lot of the people who chose to be Jewish, who maybe affiliated formally for the time that they had kids in religious school, but not before and not after. Right. And so I can bring all of these perspectives to these rabbis in training and help them think about, they are there out of a deep and profound commitment to Judaism, but what does it mean to work with people who maybe have deep and profound commitments both to Judaism and to other things, or who want some sort of relationship to Judaism, but who don't have the same kind of commitment, right? The commitment of someone who chooses to make something their life work is often inherently different than the commitments of people who didn't. And so how to get into that headspace? Like, these people they may care profoundly about the future of Judaism, but they might not. And you might not be able to convince them to care profoundly about the future of Judaism. So, what does that mean for how you work with them? And so that's been a really interesting and fun opportunity.
Awesome. Well, as I said at the top of that question, people can go and hear a really super in-depth conversation that we had for episode 142, specifically about Beyond Chrismukkah, which I believe, if memory serves me right, came out from the University of North Carolina Press, correct?
Yes.
Excellent. Well, just don't forget about that book, everybody, because it's really good. So if you are interested in anything regarding interfaith families and living, it's a great one that I enjoyed reading a couple years back. Let's turn to the book that you are currently kind of promoting, and I'm super excited to talk to you about this book that you put out with Beacon Press called "The Racism of People Who Love You," which came out. It's been about a year since it came out, correct?
Little bit more than that. It came out in January of 2023, and then it came out in paperback this past January, so just a couple of months ago.
Fantastic. Well, tell me a little bit about the first year of the life of this book and what's been enjoyable about the last year with this book from Beacon.
So, arguably, the most fun thing that has happened is that I ended up on an Oprah list of books we can't wait to read in 2023.
Nice.
And I believe that the list came out like maybe on publication day, maybe like a day before or after. But the way that I'm normally based in Colorado, and the way that I found out that this had happened is that I have an aunt who is not someone who I would who's very proud of my academic career, but is not, like my mother is a biomedical editor. My mom understands a lot of things about how my career works. My aunt is a wonderful woman, but she is not, she's an Indian immigrant. She was really raised to be sort of a corporate, like a corporate wife. And she was very good at it when my uncle was alive, but she's not someone who I would expect to encounter my career in any way, shape, or form, other than her pride in me when I tell her about it. And so it's 5 o'clock in the morning, 5:30 in the morning, because I'm in Colorado. And my aunt, who apparently gets Oprah delivered to her like inbox, like the Oprah email comes, she's reading Oprah over her breakfast. And she doesn't even know about this book, right? Like I have not told her that there's going to be a book or anything like that. And I get a phone call and it wakes me up because I've forgotten to turn the ringer off on my phone. And I see that it's my aunt. I really thought somebody had died. And I really thought that perhaps the somebody who had died was like my mother, because I would assume that my mother would be the person who would call if somebody had died, right? So I picked up the phone in like a state of panic, and my aunt was just over the moon excited that her niece had been mentioned by Oprah. So
Mm,
that's the most fun thing that has happened. It was a really cool family moment.
I love that.
And I sort of said to her, you haven't read the book yet. The book says some stuff about the family. And my aunt was like, you do you. Are you fair? Do you think you said things that are true? She was like, then let the chips fall where they may. It was very funny.
Fabulous.
But so that was the most fun thing. But I got to travel a lot promoting the book. I'm trying to go to all 50 states before my 50th birthday. So I got to add at least one state to the list. I got to go to Idaho. But I got to give a talk at Grub Street in Boston, which I've only taken one creative nonfiction class in my entire life, and that's where I took it. So that was really fun. I got to talk about the book at BU. I got to talk about the book in Philadelphia. I did sort of a book launch event there. I did a book launch event at the Boulder JCC that was really lovely and wonderful. And I've gotten to walk into random bookstores around the country. Like I was doing a book event in Seattle, and went to a bookstore that like had nothing to do with the book event. There was my book like on one of the tables facing out, like the special table displays. And I got to go and ask them. A friend of mine who is a bookseller says, don't be an ass, always sign stock. And so I got to ask if I could sign, and like bookstores are always really gracious and sometimes excited. I went into a bookstore in Newton, Massachusetts, just killing time. I was meeting somebody for breakfast and was, I forget whether I was early for breakfast and killing time beforehand or whether I just always go into an independent bookstore if I walk past one and have a couple of minutes. And there it was on the staff picks shelf.
Cool.
And so I got to sign, that was really fun, right? Like I've seen it like show up. Friends have taken pictures of it like facing out in the wild in bookstores all over the country. That's been really fun. So that's been really cool. And it's been really cool to watch my academic colleagues get so excited about a book that is in, as someone put it, real bookstores. Because so often academic press books, sometimes academic press books are in real bookstores. And I want to like emphasize that because I have lots of friends and colleagues who have written amazing books that are really accessible to the public. And sometimes they end up in, whatever your cool independent bookstore is in your hometown. But like, it's been so exciting and really supportive to have my colleagues be sending me these pictures from everywhere.
Yeah. I mean,
Somebody claims to have seen it in the Seattle airport, but I have not personally seen a my book in an airport.
well, I think that that's amazing, and I was absolutely wondering how that experience was for you of having something come out on specifically academic press, and then having something come out that was like much more widely available. I was wondering about the contrast. So you kind of read my mind about what I was thinking about the differences between like an academic and then like more of a public facing press. I just, it's such a stark contrast, you know?
Well, and things like, so I went to Swarthmore College, and Swarthmore, at least when I was a student there, claimed to produce more PhDs per capita than any other undergraduate institution in the country. I don't know if that is true. You would have to fact check that. And also you would have to fact check it for the late 90s when I was a college student. Not the most PhDs, right? But the most per capita.
Yeah.
So like I once went to the Swarthmore bookstore and they had a like books by alumni shelf. And this was when I was living and working outside of Philadelphia. And I went and I like looked at the shelf, and none of my friends in the field, like I gave them a list of like, here are, 15 books or something like that written by Swarthmore graduates who should be here. Right. And 15 might be an exaggeration, but like off the top of my head, I was like, here are the people that I graduated with or within a year or two of, and here are the books that they have written that you do not have here. Right. Like they produce so many academics that they're not excited, I don't think, about most of our academic production. But I got interviewed for the alumni magazine, right?
Cool.
And they talked about other related projects that I have and things like that. And I think that wouldn't have happened. And then, my mom was visiting my grandmother, and this like person who my mom grew up with, who also went to Swarthmore, was like all excited to see me in the alumni magazine. And that was fun. I keep hearing from friends who are not academics who have read the book, or there's an audio book.
Mm.
And like again, I have friends whose academic books have come out on audiobook. Sometimes they're public facing academic books, but sometimes they're not. Like my friend Catherine wrote a book called Christian Slavery, absolutely available as an audiobook. But many, many of my friends inside and outside of the academy have listened to this book. And so I get feedback about, apparently my non-academic voice is very much like talking to me. Like my academic voice, I imagine flashes of that come through, but like, academic writing is really different than a lot of non-academic writing. And apparently this book just sounds like talking to me. And so I've heard a lot of people who, I'm not the person who reads the audiobook, thank God.
It's hard
Because
work.
it would have taken forever. I don't know how to do that. Like I don't, and people who are professionals can like do it in basically one take. So there are some people who think it's weird that it's not my voice. There are other people who are amazed because we found a voice actor who has my accent.
Mm.
And partly that is that the voice actor is from New York City and I'm from Connecticut. But partly that's the voice actor tape recorded me talking. And she's a voice actor. She asked for how I pronounced a lot of the words in Hindi. So there are places where you're getting like a more like where the word gets said in an American accent. She wanted to know in a lot of places, like, do you want like an Ashkenazi pronunciation of this Hebrew word, or do you want a modern Hebrew, like a Israeli pronunciation? So she worked with me as well. But yeah, so all of those are things that don't really happen. Like my grandmother read this book. It's
Mm.
a little bit less clear to me whether my grandmother certainly owns my first book, but I should add, my grandmother's never said anything to me about either book. So I have no idea whether she has read, I know she read the second book. I don't know if she read the first book. But like, that's interesting, right? Like I'm used to writing things that will be read in my field, but not necessarily outside of it. And this is being read by like random friends.
That's like so exciting. I mean, I would love to know a little bit about the for anybody who doesn't know what this book is about, the racism of people who love you. The title is very self-evident for me, and like when I picked it up, I was like, this is going to be so good because the title is so perfect. But tell me a little bit about the premise and how the essays in the book kind of started to come together for you in the last several years.
So, the first thing I think it's worth saying is that there's another book worth of essays that were on the original list and that didn't get written or that got drafted but didn't end up in the book. And so the book is really about my experiences as a person with one white parent from a family that has like my mom's maiden name first appears like in terms of people we're descended from in the court records of New Haven in like 1641 or 2. So my mom's family, at least some aspects of it, have been here since basically the beginning of European colonization. And my dad showed up in Boston in like 1971, and he's from India. Although he was born before partition, and so he was born in what is now Pakistan. And so it's a lot of it is about being a person who is sort of phenotypically, and if you just have my first name and my last name, I really look like I'm part of the Indian community. But I was really raised, my mom is very proud of the fact that there's only 1 year of her adult post-college life, probably including her college life when she didn't file income taxes. But she had a really mommy track career for a lot of time. She was a freelance editor. And so I was really raised by my mom. My parents were married for about 40 years, but my dad worked really long hours a lot of that time. He was super involved by the standards of Indian men born in 1940 and not at all involved by the standards of what my friends do now, right? And some of that is he was probably kind of average involved for like a man raising kids in the 1980s. So like I really look Indian and I've got this pretty Indian name if you don't have my middle names to hand, which most of the time people don't. But I was really raised by like a Midwestern WASP.
Mm.
And so the book thinks about a lot of things like that. It thinks about what it means to be a visibly racial minority in a family that thinks of itself as very liberal and maybe progressive, but still has like a lot of assumptions about what and how it's right to be. And sometimes those assumptions are like about the value of fitting in. Sometimes it's like failure to understand that as members of the dominant culture, sort of failures to understand that you might be someone who code switches all of the time. I talk a little bit about times when I failed to code switch with my mom's family because I was really comfortable with them and I didn't think that I needed to code switch and that code switching, and then I got in trouble, right? Or times when there were like differences of cultural expectation. I'm vegetarian, and I write a little bit about a time when one of my mom's relatives like moved a spoon from a soup that was like very much like a turkey gumbo, right? Like homemade turkey stock out of a like turkey carcass after Thanksgiving, kielbasa, right? Like this is like not vegetarian soup. And there were 2 pots of soup on the stove, one vegetarian lentil soup that I had carefully made so that there would be something I could eat, because we do this every year. And for years, I like had this boyfriend who would be there with me, who would like quietly make me something delicious. The year after that relationship ended, I was like, why is there nothing delicious for me? And I realized that that was what was going on. And so I made something, but also I made something that everybody could share, because there was sometimes tension around like, if there was enough vegetarian food for me, everybody would want a helping. So I like carefully make this huge pot of vegetarian soup. And before I get any of it, one of my relatives moves the ladle from the meat soup into the vegetarian soup, which in Indian communities is absolutely a big deal no-no. You would never do that. You would understand that you've just made it non-vegetarian. I did not know that that was an Indian thing. Like I had no idea. I just know that then the soup isn't vegetarian. And I got like read the riot act by the person who had done this. There was like no apology for what she had done. Absolutely this assumption that I was being rigid and inflexible. And I was just sort of coming out of something that I had been carefully raised to think, right? And so these moments when either you don't know that you need to code switch, like, and so you screw it up, or when you decide you're comfortable and you choose not to code switch, and then get in trouble. And so like I wrote a lot about that kind of thing on the white side of the family, but on the Indian side of the family, I wrote a lot about times when I'm the oldest of the American-born grandchildren. And the next American-born grandchild is my sister. And then there's like a 4-year gap. But then in between that person and the next cadre of grandchildren, there's like an additional 7 years. So I'm quite a bit older than the bulk of the American-born grandchildren. And so I would get in trouble on the Indian side of the family for being too American. I have a memory of one of my relatives saying, like, I know that Americans show respect differently than Indian people do, but I would just be devastated if my kid showed respect for me in an American way. And this was said to me when I was 14. It was said by somebody who had been my very favorite relative. And I was old enough to know that I showed respect in American ways. I was old enough to know that the way that she knew that she would be disappointed was the distance she felt with me, or at least at 14, that's how I interpreted it. I mean, there's lots I could say about this. Like, for instance, turns out that in India, like little kids don't like spicy food anywhere. And so in India, people make food more mild. But in my family, my father started having problems, like just aging. Started needing blander food. My dad's a good chunk older, or was a good chunk older than my mom. And so we never really ratcheted the spice up. And so I would get in trouble in this family that had no kids for not liking Indian food. And I got a reputation for not liking Indian food. But the answer is just, in Indian families, you make kid food that's less spicy. And all of these young people in their 20s, the aunts and uncles who were a lot younger than my dad, they didn't have kids. They weren't thinking about making mild food. So at 4, I was being in trouble for not liking Indian food when it was just too spicy for me. And you know, in Indian families, the spice is like less intense for little kids. And so sort of places where things went wrong. And so this constant policing of authenticity. And so I wrote about that as well. I really wanted to say, like, it's not just that your white family has all of this unconscious bias and racism. It's that, like, also in my Indian immigrant family, I had all of these immigrant relatives who were afraid of what it was going to mean to raise kids in the United States. And so anytime I came across as being too American, they needed to attribute that to my being only half, to my having this white mother, rather than this is what it means to raise kids in a foreign country. And sometimes I think it is about being half, right? Like, I have a kind of cultural capital that lots of kids who are the children of immigrant parents like don't necessarily have, or have to fight hard to get. But sometimes it's just like, this is what it is to raise kids in a foreign country. You know, and a lot of that is just like, this is what it's going to mean. But I was like the oldest. And so I was the trial case for a lot of that.
Gotcha. Well, okay, so in the book, what I'm curious about now is the differentiation between
Mhm.
different kinds of racism, because there is racism of people that you know, and then there's racism of people that you don't know, right? And I'm wondering if you can differentiate these different
Mhm.
types of racism and maybe kind of like spell out a little bit what they look like, um, that you've experienced and seen.
One of the kind of initial conversations that led to the book was with my best friend since I was 18. And we were talking, we were sitting in a restaurant, and it's like, was in between the Republican National Convention and the election in 2016. And so there was a lot in the news about like the horrible racism of Trump's political rallies. And I had been living in a very white area, or I was living in a very diverse city, but like a very poor city. And so I would often go into the suburbs to get better groceries, and the suburbs were really white. And I had had some pretty awful encounters there. And we were starting to see terrible things in rallies. And I said to my friend, and he was asking what that was like. And I said to him, I mean, it's scary. I don't want to give anyone the impression that it's not terrifying to see horrible vitriolic racism against people just sort of for existing, right? Like, which most terrible, horrible vitriolic racism is basically because you exist, right? And to see that get more and more socially acceptable was horrifying, and it was scary. But it wasn't personally painful in the way that I find the racism of people who love me and people who I love. Um, and the racism of the, like, look, I live in a very liberal world. I grew up Unitarian in a very liberal religion. I converted to Judaism, and I converted through the Reconstructionist movement, which is, at the most politically liberal end of the sort of Jewish spectrum. It kind of has a reputation for being the big hippie movement. So in my personal life, I basically live in a very liberal bubble. I tend to be able to structure my life to live in relative. I've been lucky in my academic positions. Like I work in Boulder, Colorado, which has a particular reputation. I live in Denver, have lived in, Philadelphia. I've lived in Washington, D.C. When I lived in Georgia, I lived in Atlanta, or actually in a suburb called Decatur. Pretty liberal enclaves. And I'm an academic. So I basically am never around people who would say something overtly hateful. The things that they say are often hard to call out and name as racism. Is it racism when a family member looks at me, when a white family member, when I like put on Indian clothes, not because I'm going to a family function or something, but because Indian clothes are really comfortable? I
Hmm.
mean, not all Indian clothes, but like a kind of everyday hang around the house outfit for an Indian woman from the part of India that my dad's family is from. It's basically a pair of baggy pants with a drawstring and a long tunic. It's called a salwar kameez, and it's super comfortable. And so, like, why wouldn't you do that on a like day when you're a little bit more you're not in your pajamas? It's not psychologically like wearing, flannel pajamas from LL Bean all day. But it's real. Why wouldn't you do that if you're gonna like be hanging out at home doing your thing, or even if you're going out and about in the world? And so, like, is it racism for somebody, one of my relatives, to look at that and say, "So what? You're super ethnic now?" It's
Hmm.
worth noting that the person who said that also once said, when I bought this like really voluminous apron that I was kind of excited about because I thought it would keep my clothes really clean. Well, it's certainly not slimming, which it most certainly wasn't. It was
Hmm.
like gathered right under the bust, right? So it like basically made you look like you were wearing a tent of really ugly fabric. And I guess I was of an age where part of what I appreciated about it was how ugly it was. But like, right, like one of those things is possibly racist, and the other is just really critical and kind of body shaming.
Mm-hmm.
But she wasn't even really criticizing me and my body, I don't think. I think she was just saying, wow, that looks like you're wearing a tent.
Mm-hmm.
So like, is that racist? Is it not racist? Is it racist when one part of your family is really mad, or not really mad, but like doesn't have room for the fact that their culture might not be the cultural monolith of your life, right? Is it racist when somebody doesn't respect the fact that you're brought up in a culture where you don't move the spoons around? Is it racist when the fact that you don't like when we all understand that Americans can't take the full-on heat of Indian food, but the fact that you can't do it is like pointed out in social family settings and a big deal is made of it. Like, and I tend to use the word racist for the things my family does and tend to talk about it as identity policing or authenticity policing in the Indian side, just because of the relative power differences of white people versus brown people in American society, right? But like those things hurt when it comes from people you care about. They're scary when they're horrible things that come from people you don't, or aggravating, right? When like you are part of a university system that doesn't take into account the like extra labor that women and people of color, and therefore amplified if you're a woman of color, take on in universities, right? In terms of caretaking in general, or extra committee service or whatever. Like that's aggravating. It has real life consequences. Medical racism in which medical racism and medical sexism cause terrible health outcomes for women of color, in particular Black women. I don't want to minimize that at all. These things have real outcomes. But at least for me, they're not painful in the way that it's painful when I take a story of racism to a white person who I love and they diminish it.
Yeah.
And that's the racism of people who love you is from an essay about an interaction that I had with this best friend, right? So he's asking me what the like horrible racism that he can see on the television is. And I say it doesn't hurt as much as the racism of people who love me. And he says, "Are you talking about me?" And in that moment, I wasn't. I was like talking about how frustrating it is when my mother thinks that you only need to get to the airport 1 hour early, and I think you need to get there 2 hours early. And I think this for lots of reasons. I think this because I get screened. I get randomly searched about 50% of the time at the airport. And so I need to build in time for that. But also, I have seen, people running late for their flights get pulled out of line at the airport. And when I've asked if I can go ahead, because I get yelled at for not getting there earlier, right? Even when I'm like plenty ahead of time. And sometimes by other people in the line, but sometimes by, security.
So something I really like in the book is when you write about this feeling of being culturally uncomfortable where you are racially comfortable, and racially comfortable where you are culturally uncomfortable. And I really love that distinction. And I'm wondering if this book was like a cathartic experience for you in general, and what this like has brought to your life to be able to put all of these thoughts down on paper and really process all these things for yourself.
So that phrase came from my friend Tom Smith, who is an academic at Cambridge University in the United Kingdom, in Great Britain. And he read a draft of a chapter and he was like, what I love about this is that it's talking about being culturally comfortable where you are racially uncomfortable, and vice versa. So I always want to give Tom credit for that. And was it cathartic? It was really interesting because it caused me to think about things that I hadn't ever really thought about. I talked at one point to a friend and colleague who is also half white and half Asian. And he said it was really interesting to read because he had thought about this stuff a lot when he was in college. and has really stopped thinking about it.
Mm.
And I worried a little bit that he was telling me that I was being sophomoric. But I really didn't think about these things in college. I was really very comfortable for a really long time, just sort of with the cultural, like I didn't like being in Indian spaces. I felt like Indian spaces treated me badly, basically for being, brown on the outside and white on the inside. And they like accusing me of wanting to be or act white. And I was just sort of like, I was brought up by the white parent. Like we went to church with my mom. We never went to temple with my dad. And that's in part because my dad was an atheist. And the early Hindu communities tended to be more religiously conservative, right? Like the people who really felt a need to build those communities. But also my dad was from the north, and the communities near where we lived were South Indian. And so the languages were different and the food was different. Or the Indian student group wanted to get together and speak Marathi, which I don't speak, but also which is not the language that my family speaks. And I don't know how similar Marathi is to the languages that my family speaks. But like, that's not the language that I would speak even if I were bilingual, or even if I weren't bilingual, if I had like conversational competence. And so I was just sort of like, whatever, these are stupid things and they're not taking me, the fullness of who I am, into account. And like, I spent a lot of time just sort of being with the people who I was culturally comfortable with. And then as I got out of I think I was pretty protected by model minority status, which model minority status is not very good for Asian people, and it makes them terrible intersectional allies a lot of the time with other people of color. Model minority status isn't good because it implies that any racism that you encounter is because you didn't like cosplay white well enough, right? Makes it your fault. So it's bad in that way. And it also suggests that you should jettison your culture in order to cosplay white. So it's bad in a lot of ways for the people doing it, but it also like being in the model minority is predicated on the assumption that there's like a non-model or bad minority, right? So it leads to anti-Black racism in Asian communities. But I think being like and also like the model minority status is like Asian kids are obedient and really smart, which is really bad if you are not those things. I was pretty smart. Like I got good grades in school. I was not in the honors track for science and math, but that was not really about my aptitude in science. That was about my aptitude in math. The way that it worked in my high school, right, was you could be honors for the humanities or honors for math and science, and I couldn't do the math, so I was honors in the humanities. But I took like AP classes in the sciences. So I was like a academically successful kid, and I'm kind of mouthy, like I'm strong-willed, but I'm basically rule following. Like I'm scared of the ramifications of misbehavior. And so like I'm basically pretty rule followy. So like it kind of worked for me, right? And it was really as I switched teams from being a student to being somebody who had to navigate it on my own, somebody who didn't have like, even as a PhD student, there was often this like, my advisor is like a white straight man, and he's a white straight man who was not a source of racism in my life and who was often able to shield and protect me. And it's hard to tell what's racism and what's sexism. And then when I kind of got into the working world, I started experiencing more racism that I like deliberately didn't write about because I was writing about what Ta-Nehisi Coates calls the racism of good white people.
Mm.
And I didn't want to call out good white people in public in front of their colleagues for like having structural systemic bias, right? I didn't want to do that. I can anonymize my family because like, how are you going to track down my relatives? But I can't anonymize my coworkers. And I think often people make honest mistakes. They're growing, they're trying to do better. And I think that the world can be really unforgiving. So like I wrote about structures when I wrote about the academy. I said like, look, I did not have an Asian American mentor. I didn't have a South Asian mentor until I was in my first tenure track job. And really, I was like on the verge of getting tenure when I got my first Asian American mentors.
Hmm.
And that's not the fault of anyone in the academy. That's the fault of like structures, right? And so I could write about the Black professors that I had who recognized that I needed a mentor for how to be a person of color in the academy and stepped up and tried to imagine their way into what it was like to be South Asian and what those people did for me and how grateful I am. Right. Like, but I didn't want to like personalize. This is this time when like this white person had a completely understandable, like sort of gaffe, right? Like that didn't feel fair. So I wrote about my family, and it was this chance to go back into and really think about dynamics that I hadn't thought about or paid attention to. And I think almost out of self-protection. It's really hard until you're a person who can stand on your own 2 feet and has a really robust chosen family to think about the painful things about your family of origin. And, you know, it's not like my chosen family, like the friend who the title of the essay is about. Like, he is part of my chosen family. He is like the linchpin of my chosen family in a lot of ways. Part of what makes him part of my chosen family is that he is somebody who writing that essay was his idea in some ways, and he was all in and on board. Whereas members of my extended family, my mother was also on board, but members of my extended family, I knew that if I asked their permission, I wouldn't get it
Hmm.
because they would be afraid of being seen as not being perfect on the matter of race.
Hmm.
They would think it was more important to me to protect them from the judgment of being seen as racist than it would be to tell my truth in a way that I thought might help other, in particular, white people, but also immigrants, understand the ways in which sort of mixed race experience is different.
Yeah.
And so like that's the difference. Like my chosen family are people who were chosen in part because they would say like, please make me anonymous, but tell the story. I'm willing to take that risk. And actually, that friend said, you know, if now he would say, I don't necessarily need to be anonymous. And he said, like, I don't care if our mutual friends can recognize me. He might have, and he doesn't think the things that he thought then. He's grown and he's changed and he's listened and he thinks differently. And so I think if I were writing it now, he might say, use my name, but also explain that I've grown and changed.
Gotcha. Well, what are you enjoying about? I know that you did the sacred rites training cohort. You are clearly, entering a kind of a different realm of public scholarship. It seems like almost naturally. What has that experience been like for you to put this book out and then to do this public training scholarship almost kind of in tandem?
It's been really interesting. I think I joined Sacred Rites very specifically because I am trying to level up in terms of my sort of public facing writing. I do this kind of thing. I do a lot of like writing for the conversation,
Mm-hmm.
but I have not done a lot of sort of pitching and submitting to like sort of she-sheer news outlets. And I was
Mm-hmm.
trying to build that skill set. And Sacred Rites, in particular, Brooke's mentorship, Brooke Walensky Langford's mentorship, has been really helpful on that front.
Very good. Do you have any preview you want to give on like a future book project that you're working on at all?
So I am about half a chapter in terms of drafting and one chapter in terms of like making sure it's all cohesive away from having my next academic monograph completed. It's if I hadn't had the upset about moving, I would be sure it would be completed this summer. Now I'm not quite as sure, but it's going to be called God Bless the Pill,
Mhm.
Contraception and Sexuality at the moment in Tri-Faith America. Although I think I think God Bless the Pill is with us. The part after the colon is going to need a little bit of negotiation, I think. It's also going to come out with UNC Press. I also have a book under contract with Princeton University Press that will be a history of Jews of color in the United States,
Very cool.
probably over the past 100 years. I'm a post-World War II historian, and so I keep trying to get that. Like, I can imagine a world in which I go back to Fred Appel at Princeton and say, actually, past 80 years, not past 100 years, right? So we'll see. We'll see how much pre-World War II I actually do. Um, and that is not part of, but is tied to a project that I've been working on, funded by the Henry Luce Foundation, which is a project called Jews of Color, Histories and Futures, which has some public-facing events that are all going to be recorded and put up on our website, but is primarily centered around building an oral history archive housed at the University of Colorado Boulder that are Jews of color telling their own stories.
Wonderful. Well, that all sounds great. Where can folks find your work and follow along if they want to look at your past projects, but also keep up with what you've got going on in the future?
So I have a website, www.samiramehta.com. It has all of the past projects and has some links to some of the other projects. If you go to jewsofcolor.colorado.edu, that is currently the landing page for the grant. We might be moving that, but right now that'll get you there. And I think it'll always give you a link if we decide to set up another platform.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Samira Mehta, it is delightful to reconnect 4.5 years after you were first here. It's a really crazy experience just to think about the fact that you were here right in the middle of the show and you're back about 150 episodes later. It's a delight to catch up on your latest book, which is The Racism of People Who Love You, out from Beacon Press, and loving that book. It's wonderful. I've been enjoying reading it over the past week or so, and I think that everybody listening would love it as well. So go check that out. Thank you so much for being here. What a pleasure to have you back.
Thank you for having me.